We are pleased to welcome back Mr. Levi Rickert, a tribal citizen of the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, who is an award-winning Native American journalist who started Native News Online and Tribal Business News. Since its inception in February 2011, Native News Online has become one of the most read and trusted Native American daily news outlets across the country. Mr. Rickert hosts Native News Online's weekly Native Bidaske, which spotlights those making news and leading changes in Indian country. Additionally, Mr. Rickert hosts the Hope Plus Healing podcast in conjunction with the National Indian Health Board. Welcome, Mr. Rickert.
Thank you. And good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's a special day, not just because I'm here, but I'll tell you why it's special. 100 years ago today, President Calvin Coolidge signed the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, June 2nd, 1924. So today, we are observing the centennial of Indian citizenship. Now, those of you who may be students of history will recall this was actually quite a momentous occasion, because as I wrote in an editorial that was posted this morning, it was kind of the United States way of saying we're no longer going to kill Indians. Because all those years, and there have been different policies, different segments of history where they treated us differently. And the Indian Wars continued till about 1900. And it was at the point where in 1906, Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States, wrote to Edward S. Curtis, who had, some of you will remember, had gone around the country taking over 40,000 pictures of Native Americans, particularly in the West and in Alaska. And what Roosevelt wrote to Curtis was, thank you for doing this. I'm putting my own words. Because this is a vanishing race of people. They're not going to be here very long. Because history records, and depending on what count you read, there were 15, I've heard as high as 60, maybe 80 million people pre-European contact on this continent. By the time the Citizenship Act was signed by President Coolidge 100 years ago today, there were only 300,000 Native Americans. My grandparents, who were not married then, they got married in 1927, but Ellen Moore and Levi White Pigeon, I've named that to my grandfather, they were alive then. They were two of the 300,000. So I have an editorial that's in Native News Online today, Reflections of the Indian Citizenship Act. I would like you to read it. We also, a couple comments though. Amazingly enough, Native Americans have fought pre-citizenship. They fought in every battle, starting with the Revolutionary War. There was I think it was called Company K of Native Americans from this state, particularly Ottawa or Odawa, and a contingency out of Mount Pleasant, the Saginaw Chippewa, who fought in the Civil War. And I just find that amazing. So sometimes I've often asked, how is it, and even today, if you read what the Pentagon puts out. Native Americans, on a per capita basis, serve in the U.S. military, U.S. Armed Forces, more than any other racial ethnic group in the United States. True story. And I find that amazing. So I've been asked that, we have talked about it among ourselves, and one of the things that comes up is Native Americans are warriors, and we're defending the land. But 2 weeks ago, I was in Rapid City, South Dakota, talking to the chairman of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, and he brought a really interesting point up. I had never thought about this. He said, we didn't just fight for the land, but we fought to protect the Constitution of the United States. Why? Because within the Constitution of the United States are treaties. Now, it's been written, there's never been a treaty 100% fulfilled 100%. But I think that's interesting that we have fought to protect the Constitution because of the treaties. Now, this is church, has a special status. I'm not supposed to get political. But I will throw this in. I wish some other people would like to protect the Constitution of the United States. Because there is one man running for president of the United States now who basically wants to alter the Constitution of the United States. So in that regard, Native Americans have it way over the head of him, way past him. So enough politics. Deb Haaland is Secretary of the Interior. She is the first Native American cabinet member serving a secretarial role in the presidential cabinet in the history of the United States. Joe Biden did that. 100 years after the citizenship, Deb Haaland is our Secretary of the Interior, a Native American woman. I think we should clap about that. Lynn Mabarrell. She is a chief of the Mohegan tribe, is the U.S. Treasurer of the United States. Not all dollar bills, because they keep the money fluid, right? But the newer versions have a Native American signature on there as Treasurer of the United States. Chuck Sams, who is a tribal citizen of the Confederate tribes, the Umatilla tribes out in Oregon. He is the director of the National Park Service. First time ever a Native American's ever held that post. 100 years after the signing of the Citizenship Act. Now, I will tell you this as publisher, editor of Native News Online, when I came to the realization that we need to do something about this, because I would venture to say 99.8%, maybe even closer to 100% of Americans do not have any clue today is the 100th anniversary. How many of you knew that when you came in here? One person back there. It was on the radio. All right. I've been seeing NPR's done something, some of the AP's run a story. So we're all over it this month. We're going to have a series of commemorations. But back to my point, when I first was saying, we got to do something about this. This is probably back in January, February. And our editorial staff got together, and we were actually using the word celebration. Boy, did we get pushback from tribal leaders. Why are we celebrating this? This was tearing away our sovereignty. So I will say this. Native Americans are not a monolith. I'm a proud citizen of both the United States, and my tribe is the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation. I take pride in that. Now, I will confess, I haven't always stood up for the national anthem particularly when my son played basketball. He was a starter on the team, and he's a good kid, good basketball player. But there were things, I was running the North American Indian Center in Grand Rapids at the time. There were things that I was coming aware of, how we were treated. So I must be blunt, I was not feeling it. And there's time I just sat down. So when this quarterback got in trouble and everybody came, what a bad person he was, unpatriotic and all that, I understood it. So sometimes you have to kind of go where you are, inside of yourself. And I'll tell you another story. I was making testimony in 1996 for a Senate committee, Michigan State Senate committee, subcommittee. And the topic really was about Indian casinos, as I recall. There was a state senator, as I was speaking, got redder and redder in his face. He was just mad at me. He did not like anything I was saying. You guys are a good crowd. I don't see any red faces out there. No Redskins, right? That's a joke. So I had introduced myself as a citizen of the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, which I typically do. Well, I already was. Dave did a good job of that earlier. And he called me back to the podium. I was a much younger man. He said, "Young man, come back to the podium." Okay. He said, "Do you consider yourself a U.S. citizen? I noticed you gave your tribal citizenship when you introduced yourself." Well, this was kind of cute. I had behind me about 10 or 15 Native Americans. And I said, "I know the IRS does." Well, I think that made his face just one more shade of deeper red. But we are dual citizenship, dual citizens. And one thing that happened at 1924 it was not a magical thing. It didn't cure all the problems. We still have high rates of unemployment, high rates of poverty. We still have voter suppression. There were some states, because voting in the United States is really controlled by states, right? States' rights. They dictate how elections are handled, who can vote. There were some states, Maine and Utah were, I think, the last two states, and Arizona was not too far behind, that allowed, and I think it was Utah, it was 1957, it was court decision said you have to let these Native Americans vote. But this is what I hear even in 2024. When I go to conferences, national conferences by national Native American organizations. I'm flying out this afternoon to Cherokee, North Carolina. Somebody told me relative to Cherokee from the Eastern Band. I'm flying down there this afternoon because they have the National Congress of American Indians starts tomorrow morning. But what I hear at the conference is this, and I hear it from people from the Native American Rights Fund, that Native Americans many times have to travel up to 100 miles to go vote. I wrote an editorial last cycle. It says, un-American for someone to have to drive 99 miles to go vote. Because what happens is, particularly on reservations where their roads are not like the roads out here, but they are typically not even unpaved, bumpy. And you remember those days when I'm old, so I remember the days when a lot of roads weren't paved in Michigan, and particularly up in Mount Pleasant. It was like you went up there, it was like a washboard road. And when it rains or the snow, it alters the road, and then the guys have to come out with a big grader and grade it down and make it smooth again. But voter suppression. And folks, let me tell you this, it's real in the United States. It's real on Indian reservations. In North Dakota, The legislature passed a bill that basically required that voters had to have ID with a physical address on it. There was a problem because the U.S. Postal Service has not given every home on reservations a physical address. They have you see what apartment or condo complexes, right? You see those, a bunch of mailboxes, right? You can go in there and you turn your key and you get your mail. They don't have physical addresses. And what some guys were saying at a recent conference about voter suppression is in South Dakota, these big, burly, can I just say it the way I want to, white guys show up, cowboy hats, and intimidate the living daylights out of their Native American elders. They don't even want to go back and vote. So, whereas 100 years later, I'm happy where we are, but we still have a lot of work to do to overcome a lot of those things I just talked about. I do want to read, if I can find it on my phone here. Let's see here. Secretary Holland, Secretary of the Interior Holland, submitted this essay, which you ran today as an exclusive. And this is what she wrote about the 100th anniversary of the Indian Citizenship Act. It is difficult for me to order out the fireworks in celebration of the Indian Citizenship Act's centennial, because my people were here long before the Mayflower, in the Pilgrims, and before the cow was introduced to North America. I learned something when I read that one. We have always been citizens of this continent. Our citizenship runs deep, and in spite of every Indian war, assimilation policy, and outright assault on our land, animals, and ways of life by newcomers, we have persevered. Knowing that my ancestors survived to give me breath, and that my family's customs and traditions have survived through it all, gives me hope that our future generations will also have them to pass down. That's from Secretary Holland. She was talking about the policies of assimilation. And now I'm going to transition over and tell me how many minutes I have left. I'm a talker. I don't want to bore you. I want to talk about boarding schools, Indian boarding schools. And somebody told me today that some of you went over to the Nottawassippi here on Potawatomi recently, I think Thursday, and so you kind of had a crash course. So I'm not gonna get too far into the weeds on that, because I could speak about that for hours. But I will say this: after 3 years ago, Memorial Day weekend, there was an announcement out of Camp Loops, British Columbia, that 215 bodies were discovered in this big, massive grave. Do you remember that? That was a time that I say the world kind of woke up to the fact that we had these Indian boarding schools. And I will say this, and I've said it when I've been on radio, particularly out of Washington, D.C., let's not confuse boarding schools, these Indian boarding schools, with what the wealthy send their kids to boarding schools to get refined and get educated. That was not pleasant. My grandmother, Ellen Moore, went to Genoa Indian boarding school. She had a tattoo on her wrist. And I will tell you this, that I didn't go to a boarding school, nor did my mother go to a boarding school. But we've had to live with they call it historical trauma associated with boarding school. 3 weeks after the mass grave was disclosed, Secretary Holland said, to the National Congress of American Indians mid-year conference that she and her indigenous staff wept when they discussed it. She on that day, established the Federal Indian Boarding School Investigative Committee. Gave them 1 year to come up with a report. They came up with a report. They did the best they could to disclose how many boarding schools there were. There's still so much work to be done. Because in 1928, there was a report through the Department of the Interior, but Brookings Institution actually did it for the Department of the Interior by a gentleman by the name of, I can't think of his first name, but his last name was Merriam. It's called the Merriam Report. Back then they said the record keeping was so poor that they had no idea what was going on. And they described how kids were starving in these schools. And I think about it in terms of time, 1928, that's 1 year before the Depression, right? Because my mom grew up in the Depression. How many have parents that grew up in the Depression or grandparents that they were poor? My grandfather, Levi White Pigeon, had 10 children. One passed away in infancy, but so there were 9. So they had a lot of mouths to feed during the Depression. So I think about, man, if it was bad before the Depression, what was it like during the Depression for these kids in these Indian boarding schools? Secretary Holland established what she called the Road to Healing. And the Road to Healing was 12 stops across the United States where she and Assistant Secretary Brian Newland, who is a member of the Bay Mills Indian community up at Brumley, Michigan, they went to various locations, took testimony from survivors and descendants of the survivors in Indian boarding schools. I'm happy to report Native News Online attended every single one of those listening sessions. I went to 11 of 12. And the only reason I couldn't go to the one is my brother passed away. And he passed away on Tuesday. The listening session was going to be on Saturday, and I just could not leave my family. So we sent a reporter. But I went around the United States. I listened to the stories of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. The Washington Post this past Wednesday, you really owe it to yourself to get online and read this article. They really got into the sexual abuse more than we did. And it's quite amazing when you heard the testimonies of the elders who had gone through these traumatic experiences. They were pretty consistent wherever you went, whatever region you are in the United States. Physical, emotional, sexual abuse. Now, one particular man stands out, and he's actually cited in the Washington Post article. Because I actually saw, he was describing getting beat by the Jesus rope. Now, I'm in church, so I'm going to say a Jesus rope. Now, let me give you the setting. Kids came to the boarding schools, they're going to bed, they were crying late at night. They were crying because they missed their parents. Parents, plural. Now, I will say this. The only thing I can equate to that is when I was 5 years old, my mother had cancer. I was sent for 2 weeks to my stepfather's family up in Shepherd, Michigan. 2 weeks. I remember, and I'm going to tell you, these people were nice to me. Fed me, made sure I was clean, bought me a pair of shoes, a new pair of shoes. Nice to me. But I remember just having this like hurt, or the separation, the loneliness I was feeling because my mom was not there. And when you're 5, you really don't know what's going on. You might hear the word cancer, but I was so hurt, so lonely. And then one Friday, I still remember, it was a February day. I have a pretty good memory. The good Lord in heaven, the Creator, gave me a good memory. I remember it was a February day, my grandfather, Levi, White Pigeon, came and got me. He walked out to his car, and you know how like late afternoon in February, they got the clouds, but you got some like red sky coming through the clouds. I remember that. And I remember my grandfather saying, I'm picking you up. Everything's going to be okay. So I think about that, and I'm going to call it anguish because it was anguish. I can speak for myself. I was in pain. I was separated from my mother. But can you imagine being in a boarding school, months on end, separated from your parents? And all in the name of assimilation. Kill the man, kill the Indian, save the man. That was the mantra. Meaning, not kill us literally, but strip us of that culture, strip us of that Indian. Wash their mouth out with soap for speaking the native tongue. Ironically enough, I'm glad it didn't work in Navajo Nation because the Navajo Nation produced code talkers that helped save democracy in the South Pacific. True story. So I'm happy that they were not successful. But here these kids are crying. Instead of the priest or nun saying, little Johnny, here's a cookie, here's some milk, go to bed, things are going to be okay in the morning, they got beat. And this man described out there at one of these Road to Healing out in Tulalip, Washington, how they had a choice between this board with holes in it, a strap looked like a razor strap, or what they called the Jesus rope. And it looked like, because he brought these replicas, he's going, this is how I remember it. So it was like a clothesline with beads on it. So after he got as he was speaking, people were literally tears on their eyes. I'm taking photos, tears coming down my face. I look over, I saw this lady from the Washington Post, tears in her eyes. So I'm so happy she captured that in the Washington Post, the Jesus rope. So I said, afterward, I said, I got to talk to you. I told him who I was. And he said, you know how like Jesus got beat so bad? How they describe in the Bible? They open up his skin. That's what happened. These kids would just get beat so much, tore open the skin with those beads on that rope. And I'm going to say this. I'm in church now. How evil is that? Call it the Jesus rope. And I don't even say this to be dramatic, because I'm telling you, this is what was said. This is what these kids endured. Beatings instead of love. And I say that because in any one of our lives as human beings, as we grow, we interact with our family, our friends, the interpersonal relationships are so critical. So critical. Good or bad, but you know them. Kids would come home from Indian boarding schools and they had not grown with them. Some of these kids were gone for 8, 10 years. Can you imagine being separated from your mother and then all of a sudden have to go back and everything's great? You don't even know them. You don't know them. You know them as your mother, but you don't really know them because you didn't develop together. You didn't have the interpersonal relationships. And because of that, even today, Native Americans suffer. Every single, and as Secretary Holland and Assistant Secretary Newland have said numerous times, every Native American family in America suffers the historical trauma associated with boarding school. Happened in my family. My grandmother, as I knew her, was a very loving person. She passed away when I was, I think, my early 30s, and she was 89. I love that woman. I love my grandfather, Levi White, because they were wonderful people. But I'll tell you this, and Secretary Holland has said this, now that we're studying this, you go back in your family and go, that's why that happened. That Southern anger that we get as Native people. Because I've gotten it. I've talked to my son just recently. He has had it. We're trying to overcome these things. But that Southern anger is, you're mad, you don't even know why you're mad, but it's like that something in our DNA that is passed down from one generation to the next. It's trauma, historical trauma. So I didn't come here to really preach at you and tell you how bad life was for Native people, but that is part of our history. Part of our history. Native News Online produced a book, and we're actually sold out. But if you guys want a copy, it's $25. They'll be available in, I think, 3 or 4 weeks. So they're on order right now. But it's very popular, and we probably should have ordered more. I know we should have ordered more, but we went through them just like that. And because people want to know about what happened in Indian boarding schools. And we say this, I like to end with a very high note. And I'll speak personally. Even with the trauma that's been in my family, God has been good to my family. I know that. I had 2 of the most beautiful grandparents, Levi and Ellen White Pigeon. I mentioned them in my editorial because they were alive in 1924. But I can't think of 2 people who taught me more, not even to be Native American in the traditional sense, ceremonial, because they were apostolic Pentecostal people. But they taught me and my siblings, their grandchildren, my aunts and my uncles, to love each other. And what a beautiful thing the word love is. I've seen in some of your hymns, some of your sayings already today. Wouldn't it be great if we could just all get along? We live in a society where we are so partisan. I think, I'm from Grand Rapids. Jerry Ford was our congressman when I was a kid. 25 years he served in Congress. But he was not nasty. He was not a nasty partisan. He could get together with Tip O'Neill, go out on the golf course, and cut deals. We don't have that anymore. And what really amazes me about America is this. The polls will show that depending on which one you read, maybe 10, 15% at the most, think Congress is doing what they're supposed to be doing. But yet, during re-election time, about 92% get reelected. So go figure that one out. So we need to have these kind of discussions. Like, if we're going to make a change, maybe we need to change the people who are going there to represent. Because going to represent their constituents in Washington does not mean they should be up in New York outside the trial, okay? I'm trying to be good today, I'm sorry. but that's not doing the work of their constituents. Supporting a felon. So what can I leave you with? Uplifting. God is love. We all should love one another. So thank you very much. Chimigwich, see you. Let me know if you want this book. You can reach out through whoever, Joe, somebody, and they'll know how to get a hold of me. So, is this my water? Okay, great. Thank you.